size of me and then my screen, right? Okay, wonderful. So I'll be talking with you tonight about native plants. Thank you for coming. So the New England Wildflower Society points out using native plants is the ultimate environmentally friendly garden practice. So, whoops, there we go. All right, so a few topics I will be addressing tonight are why natives are important, what they are, how do we use them at home, what are some things to think about if you are planting a native garden. Does that mean you need to rip out your existing garden? Can the non-natives and the natives exist? Can they coexist? Can you be friends with your neighbors who plant peonies? What are some invasive plants to avoid and why? And some sources for native plants. Okay, so I'm going to start with a story. And this is the house that I grew up in Butler County, Ohio. Now this house is maybe over 100 years old, maybe 120 years old by now, with a great big silver maple in the front. And there is a ravine and a creek over there off to the right. So this is what the house currently looks like. We have since moved from the house. My mother lives elsewhere, and I, of course, am in Columbus, Ohio. So I'm going to show you some pictures, and I want you to tell me whether or not you can see a similarity in these pictures, okay? So maybe you can guess which kid is me in this picture. So this is one of those things where your mom takes a picture of you, of course, at the start of each school year. So what did you notice in this picture? I guess you can't talk to me right now, but I'm hoping that you noticed this plant, which is called obedient plant, or FSWCD virginiana. It's called obedient plant because if you move those blossoms around at their base, they stay where they're put. Now, the plant is notoriously not obedient at all. It actually spreads quite vigorously through underground rhizomes, and it really, really appreciates wet areas. It's a great plant for the edge of wetlands or stream margins. It likes full sun. It's good for rain gardens as long as that soil doesn't dry out. So the point in bringing that up is that when I saw those non-native plants planted at our old house, I was really heartbroken, surprisingly upset and disappointed that they hadn't kept this little piece of Ohio heritage with this old 120-year-old farmhouse. And of course, I didn't know that at the time. I didn't know that when I was like 10 years old. I was kind of annoyed that I had to water the plants with such frequency. But if you want to learn about this obedient plant, a great source is Lady Bird Johnson's Wildflower Center. So you can figure out in which states it's native to. Granted, states are very large, but it'll tell you a little bit about how the plant likes to grow and some distinguishing characteristics so you can identify it in the field. So can you imagine that lovely purple contrasted with the pale yellow? It was so lovely, and we always got comments on it in the summer. So what they did instead was they planted the false cypress. These are the two tiny little shrubs there in the front. Now, false cypress, there are some of these kinds of plants that are native to really the eastern seaboard and a very narrow strip in the United States. And of course, many of these are also native to Asia. So I would be willing to bet these are not native plants. And I was upset that they had planted the Barbie and Ken in the landscape. Things that kind of look good, but they don't really serve an ecological function or purpose. Whoops, I'm having some trouble controlling my screen scroll here. All right. So what are the benefits of native plants? Well, there's a lot. They don't require amounts of fertilizers and pesticides. They're generally really resilient plants because they co-evolved in our weather and in our climate and with our bugs and with our fungus. They require less water for that reason, generally speaking. They help reduce air pollution because they don't have to be maintained like a lawn. And of course, they help promote biodiversity and stewardship of our natural heritage. And I like to say they can save you money as well by putting less time and maintenance into a manicured landscape. Okay, so how do we know that a native plant is native, or where is it native to, or what does that definition mean? So plants are always native to summer, of course. So are we talking about the general Midwestern region? Are we talking about the Eastern United States? So that can have a very broad definition. Sometimes you hear plants talk about plants that are endemic or indigenous, and that applies an extremely narrow range of existence. So something that's driven by unique levels of humidity or moisture or elevation, that kind of thing. We have some of those in Ohio, such as the lakeside daisy up in Cleveland, which is an endangered plant. So how do we get to our different kinds of habitats within Ohio? And we have many. We've got, most of us live in a modified urban or suburban homestead, right? We have some wetlands, we've got some ponds, not as many as we used to. We have some forested or at least woodland areas, some areas that used to be farm fields that are now recovering and are experiencing what we call that, the secondary growth with old farm fields. So some of the things that influence the different habitats in Ohio include glaciers. So here in central Ohio, we were of course glaciated. It's why we're so flat. And it partially explains why we have such good deep soil and why we have an appropriate pH to host a lot of garden plants, as well as some of the perennials that we have. And of course, this exposes different levels and layers of the bedrock, and exposes, different parts of the state, different ridges and valleys. So we do have quite a lot of variety within Ohio, and if you travel to Southwest Ohio, for example, you will see lots of pH neutral kind of loving plants like red cedars, for example. And if you travel to Southeast Ohio into the Appalachian area, you're going to find hemlocks and white cedars and leatherwoods and cranberry viburnum, and even azaleas and rhododendrons. And if you try to plant those plants here in central Ohio or southwestern Ohio, you will find that you have to really amend your soil and make it a little bit more acidic, so these plants don't struggle to find the nutrients that they need. Okay, so how do we know about our native plants? So this is a Cincinnati area botanist named Lucy Brown, and actually I think you pronounced that Brown despite the spelling. And she passed away in 1971, but what a fantastic woman and what a fantastic story. So she and her sister were one of the first couple of women to graduate from the University of Cincinnati with their PhDs. And so her sister was an entomologist, and they traveled around the country studying natural history. And Lucy created a map of every county and told us what species were present. Now, in addition to that kind of literature and those studies, we also have herbarium or herbaria, and that's where you collect plant species, you collect their roots and their fruits and their flowers, and then you press them and you stick them in a museum. So that's a little bit about how we got here, and how we knew what used to exist here before. And these are the plants that are, of course, not introduced by direct or indirect human activity. And as you can probably imagine, we at one time had many more native plants than we do now. Let's see. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how do you figure out what a cultivar is, or a variety of a native plant, because these are words we hear often within the nursery industry. So the obedient plant that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, there's that plant there on the left. So that is a plant that looks a little bit different, and it has white flowers. So if you go to the nursery, you're going to see it called Miss Manners, and that's because it was bred to be less vigorous and spreading than the original FSWCD virginiana. So there are some plants that are called variety. And so if you look at that royal catchfly there, well, you can see there's a brilliant red flower, and just underneath that, there's this beautiful pink salmon colored flower. So this is a plant that occurred naturally in nature. It is an aberration of the norm. And since then, it has been bred Actually, no, I take that back. I don't think this actually has been bred, but you will find this plant in nature, and it's a variety of the royal catchfly. If it were bred and if it were available to you for purchase at a nursery, we would call that a cultivar, and they would give it this really catchy name. Like, and you can see some of them here. You can see we've got purple coneflowers that are called white swan and double pink delight. So those are going to be your cultivars of our native purple coneflower. And so that's how you can distinguish those. I hope that helped. Now, the native plant enthusiasts out there will let you know enthusiastically that if you are to purchase a double pink delight plant like the one you see, that is not as helpful for native pollinators because they don't exactly know how to handle that bloom or that blossom, and they can't access the nectar and the pollen as they once did. So there's a lot of interesting studies out there. I think the general consensus is the closest you can stay to the native plant, what we call the straight species, the better success our birds and our insects and our mammals will have finding usefulness of that plant. Okay, and here's what I just said written out. So some people, particularly probably you or I, we plant native in an effort to restore and cherish nature. So we perhaps like to think about plants of our childhood, and we like to plant species that we know are unusual and hard to find, and we're trying to attract the rusty patched bumblebee or what have you, or we know that the finches feed on the seeds of the purple coneflower. Other agencies, particularly larger landowners, might plant with the idea of restoration. So, again, what used to be here? What's a seed mix or a variety of plants that can help bring this area back to its original state? So Ohio, as I mentioned, is relatively diverse. We have nearly 2,000 flowering plants representing 150 plant families. However, as a result of mostly ignoring them, almost 30% are at risk of becoming extinct. So, you've probably heard enough in the environmental world of gloom and doom. So I won't belabor the point, just to mention our pollinators are in decline, our arthropods are in decline, our birds are in decline. And birds are what really need these bugs, and the bugs feed on the native plants. So we are just now beginning to see the forest through the trees with this sort of thing. So you may have heard of this guy, Doug Tallamy. You can't really escape a native plant talk without hearing about Doug Tallamy. And he's an entomologist. I think he was based at the University of Delaware. So he began to see the forest through the trees and really gave us a lot of demonstrative studies that illustrated that some of these plants are better than other plants at hosting wildlife, native plants in particular. So the number one woody plant or tree that hosts wildlife is an oak tree. And, we're talking 500 species of Lepidoptera. So our moths and our butterflies rely on the oak tree as a host plant. So that's followed by willow, species of cherry, birch, poplar, crabapple are berries. And now, again, you can't grow those in central Ohio, at least not very well unless you amend the soil, but you will find those in, Southeast Ohio, and they're delicious. So maples, elms, and pines as well. A little more about that interrelationship. So when we talk about host plants, sometimes we mean a lot of animals and insects depend on one plant, or sometimes it's just one kind of insect that needs one kind of plant. So we've all heard about the monarch butterfly and milkweed plant species. So the common milkweed, which is what is pictured here, actually hosts a number of cool beetles and caterpillars. But obviously, the monarch caterpillar is what we know very well. So there's actually 12 species of milkweeds that are native to Ohio. Depending on what you're looking for and the habitats that you have available, of course, that'll influence your plant choice. I would personally not recommend you plant common milkweed in a residential plot because it can be weedy and it does tend to get away from you, I would plant maybe swamp milkweed, which is beautiful. It's relatively well behaved. If you have a larger piece of land, yeah, go with that common milkweed. If you have enemies, give them some common milkweed seeds. I'm sort of just kidding. And then let's see, the second photo there, we've got blue lobelia, and a hummingbird moth is coming to feed on that blue lobelia. It's a great plant for wetter sites, as is red lobelia or cardinal flower. And the third photo, we have a spice bush swallowtail. She is laying her eggs on a spice bush shrub, of course. And it's not the only shrub that she can use, but it's, of course, one of the important ones. And so, and this is now a national issue. This was put out by the Obama administration, so it's a bit dated by now, but as you can see, we have, of course, statewide attention and national attention to the decline of our pollinators. Pollinator populations depend directly on plant populations, especially native plants. So Talamy, as I mentioned before, provided some information that native ornamentals support 29 times more biodiversity than alien ornamentals. So as with the tree list before, here are some popular herbaceous plants for hosting that wildlife, starting with some asters. Both goldenrods and asters are in what we call the, and actually, the top four are in what we call the aster family, or when I studied botany, that's what we call the aster family, the aster ACE, but specifically the goldenrod, asters, sunflower, joe pye, or boneset. And a lot of these actually bloom late in the season. But some of our native morning glories are sedges, which, most people don't know a whole lot about sedges, but they kind of look like unassuming grass plants. And then you'll see honeysuckle and you'll think, wait a minute, honeysuckle is the enemy, right? Honeysuckle is what I desperately try to get rid of. But we do have native honeysuckle. We've got a native honeysuckle vine, in fact, more than one, and we have a native honeysuckle shrub, a woody shrub, really quite the workhorse. And there again is that woody plant list. So what are some different kinds of growing habits of native plants? So you may have heard about spring ephemeral plants, and picture there is Jack in the pulpit. So spring is my favorite time of year because I get to see some of these plants and then I have to wait until the following spring to see them again. They pop up really quickly and they take advantage of the limited sunlight that's coming through the canopy. And then when the trees start to leaf out, they lose their sunlight and they go dormant and they live back in the ground. So at this time of year, you're going to see, wild ginger, and you're going to see all of the flowers of our lovely violets, and you're going to see, gosh, the names are escaping me right now. Canada anemone, all sorts of cool things. In the summer, we have picture here, blazing star. So that's really going to be the height of flowering for a lot of plants that are perennials. And then finally in the fall, as I mentioned here, some of those important asters, and those are really important for migratory insects. So like our monarch butterfly, for example. Okay, so more about the different natives within different habitats of Ohio. We don't have many wetlands because most of them were degraded or destroyed in the effort to convert our land to agriculturally productive land. So here's some that you might see should you locate a wetland or a very wet area in which the seed bank was already there. We have vervain, and that there's a red cardinal flower I mentioned earlier. Lots of species of buttercups. There is a plant blooming now called lesser celandine that I'll address later, but this is a wonderful alternative to that. Blue flag iris. We've got some, I think that's Queen of the Prairie. And then I see swamp milkweed, which I mentioned earlier, hibiscus, turtle head, and of course, a water plant, one of the water lilies. All right, here are some additional wildflowers for you. So the prairies that we had here were generally thought to be created and maintained by Native Americans. But of course, most of Ohio was originally forested. And you've probably heard that a squirrel or whatever mammal could make its way across the whole state via treetops. Here we go. So these are a couple of maps that attempt to show the original and modified habitats of Ohio. And here's where you can find some of the prairie regions in Ohio. Around here, the Darby Plains is our closest location. And I think I have a picture. Yeah, so old cemeteries are really fascinating because this is where the prairie remnants still exist. And so the topsoil in these prairie areas is actually very deep. It's noticeably deep, and these things are sitting in the middle of farm fields. But because that soil has not been stripped away and planted with corn, it stands several inches higher, and you get these cool little patches of prairie, you know, in the middle of gravestones. So visit those if you get a chance. It's really unique. So again, most of Ohio was forested. You know, we had more in the way of some plants like oaks and of course the Ohio chestnut that we've since lost. So some other species like beech and hickories are moving in to take the place of some of those plants that are no longer with us. We have increased our wooded areas since 1942 because farming as well has gone down. And this is something that's really always changing. And the challenge that you have is, you know, keeping those invasives out if you're trying to encourage natives. So now I'm going to talk to you about some native plants that I like and that I think do very well in landscapes. I hope that's okay. I don't know because I cannot see you. So the first one here is switchgrass. This is a very well utilized and very hardy native grass. It's been bred quite a bit to be whatever you want it to be. So it can be 7 feet tall, it can be 3 feet tall, it can be narrow, it can be wide, it can be, you know, blooming here, as you can see with this red hue. They're, you know, switchgrasses that bloom with a yellow hue and others that bloom with a blue hue, and their leaves are differently colored as well. They turn different colors in the fall. Again, it's a really great one for rain gardens because it's just so adaptable and so tough. So if you have something like miscanthus or one of the other common landscape grasses growing in your landscape, this is one to consider. Another one of my favorite grasses is called prairie dropseed. And look at how beautiful that is. It's really sometimes very difficult to get a good picture of this plant, but it's, you know, it has this very fountain-like habitat. And when it blooms late in fall, you know, the sprays of seed heads, they fall over. It has a really unique scent to it. You either like it or you do not. Whoops. Okay, river oats. This is one that, like the obedient plant, is rather vigorous. So this is a great one for wet areas like stream sides, but I would watch out if you want to plant this one in your home landscape. So like with the common milkweed, you're going to have to keep your eye on it, but look at how beautiful and ornamental those seed heads are. It's a really cool one, and it's great for stream side erosion and keeping that soil in place. Okay, that's another version of the same plant with those broad, bright green leaves. Okay, a little bit on shrubs. This is called the Eastern Wahoo euonymus. You may have heard about the wing euonymus or the burning bush, That one, unfortunately, is a non-native counterpart that is now considered invasive and problematic. So this is our native counterpart that you will sometimes see in woodlands. And what a cool name, Wahoo euonymus. It's named for a Native American tribe. So that's what the fruits look like. Pretty beautiful. Whoops. Okay, and spice bush. So we heard about spice bush a little bit earlier, but what a beautiful fall color that has. It's aromatic if the leaves are crushed. The berries that the females produced used to be used as a substitute for the allspice. And of course, it hosts not only the swallowtail spicetail, or pardon me, the spice bush swallowtail, but also a large silk moth. So how cool. A couple of photos of that. Excuse me. So here is a plant called a rush. So similar to a sedge, they look like a clump of grass, right? To the unwary eye. And these are typically found in wetter or sterile soil. And they are pretty resilient and hardy. And this one is actually, I can't tell if that's a flower or fruit, but it's pretty inconspicuous. And so that is about as ornamental as it gets, but it's really wonderful for very wet sites. And it is semi-evergreen, so it looks like this, all through the winter. Here's another favorite sedge. It's called Gray's sedge. And the seed heads on this are really quite ornamental and decorative. You can see it's that cool mace-like seed head. Again, it's a great one for wet areas. So people call me all the time and they say, my grass is dying. How do I fix this problem? And I generally say, you can't fix this problem, but here are some plants that you can plant. So what do you consider when you're planting, well, really any landscape, but so what's the purpose of the plants? Are you simply trying to create or improve habitat? Do you know where your utilities are located? What do you currently have in the landscape? Do you have plants that only, bloom in the summer? So this, could tell you, okay, well, you're going to plant, nothing but mayapple in that patch. And then after the mayapple goes dormant, then you're going to maybe think about some trillium, and then the trillium is going to go dormant. And then you're going to think about Jacob's ladder or something like that. What kind of shade do you have? All sunny, all shady some of the year, sunny some of the year. What are your soils like? Most of us live in a modified, again, suburban habitat, and that means that your topsoil has been stripped away, and maybe your subsoil was piled on top of that soil, unless you're very fortunate and you've got an older house that has some of the native topsoil. So one thing we hear oftentimes about native plants is that they're really well adapted and they don't need anything to thrive. But I don't know necessarily that that's always the case because of how modified and how different our landscapes are now than they were before. It's hotter than it was, it's wetter than it was, the native soil isn't there. So if you want success for your native plants, and I'm sure you do, soil amendment or composting is the way to go. It can fix both well-drained and poorly drained soils, and it can free up some of those nutrients that our native plants need. Okay, so I was out one day and I saw this photo of Vinnie Tremonti's property in Gahanna, and it had so many lovely natives in it, including you can see a flowering dogwood over there. There's you can catch some blooms of a eastern redbud there, it's purple. There are some trillium blooming, and what else? Maybe Virginia bluebells back there. There's another photo. But it was such a lovely landscape, and what appealed to me about it, and here's a little buckeye, I think. What appealed to me about it is that he has a lot of non-natives in there as well. So he's got this bleeding heart, and he's got these lovely tulips, and I can't quite remember what else he has here. Oh, we also have some, I think this is a native buttercup back here, maybe a wood poppy or a marsh marigold, something like that. So when I looked more closely, I determined he had about half native species and half non-native species. So the point being here, he had colors and blooms for all season. And you don't have to remove your non-natives entirely to create a native landscape. Okay, so what are some plants that are more suitable for wet conditions? I've included a list here, and they include the red maple, river birch, sycamore, the swamp white oak, red bud, black haw viburnum, red osier dogwood, spice bush, and of course willow. Drier conditions, the eastern red cedar, again the red bud. It's a very versatile plant called nine bark, of which you will find a lot of cultivars at your local nursery. Black haw viburnum, a nice understory shrub, bur oak, and the Ohio buckeye. What about shady conditions? Arbor vitae. This one is kind of an unusual plant. It's actually endangered in Ohio, but it has been bred so much that you see it very commonly in landscapes, and it comes in all shapes and all sizes. So spice bush, our pawpaw, which you probably recognize that fruit there pictured, red bud, viburnum, flowering dogwood, Ohio buckeye, river birch, and sugar maple. So people frequently ask me about deer pressure. So what can I plant deer will leave alone? And I will tell you that deer typically don't like plants that are fibrous or plants that are sticky. So those that have resin or sap, they tend to stay away from grasses as well. But depending on where you live, you know that they will eat almost anything when they are hungry enough. So particularly in the winter when pickings are slim, that's when they tend to encroach upon your landscape that you thought was safe. So here's a brief list here. All right, what about invasive plants? Well, we've got quite a bit of them. You will see, I think we have 4 species of actually the shrub honeysuckle. And you can tell that one because it's got opposite leaves and it has a hollow pith. That was brought here on purpose to stabilize landscapes and to provide habitat. But of course, remember, it doesn't have our native attackers, right? It doesn't have our native pathogens or our fungi or our mammals or our insects. So without that control, it's really enjoying the same kind of climate that it did in Asia. And it's really succeeded at outcompeting many of our native plants. It just can't get a hold on it. It leaves out very early in the summer, and then it doesn't lose those leaves until very late in the season. Next, we have garlic mustard. I bet this is a plant that you have all seen as well, and it grows in woodlands. And it was brought here on purpose as a culinary herb. Purple loosestrife, I'm seeing this more and more commonly up and down the Scioto River. Beautiful plant, completely chokes out wetlands. Tree of Heaven on the bottom there was brought here as food for the silk moth industry. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, Sarah, how could you attack the silk industry here in Ohio that is just so burgeoning at this particular time? In the middle, we have a Japanese knotweed that's particularly pernicious. And I have seen cultivars of that at our local nursery, so that's a little bit worrisome. And of course, we also, you may be familiar with the Callery pear. That is an established invasive, but that's still being sold at nurseries as well for a few more years. Now, Lesser celandine is one that may be blooming right now. Maybe you'll be able to tell me, but it completely blankets wet areas like along stream sides. And native plants just can't get any leaves through that mat. So a story about the garlic mustard. So the West Virginia white butterfly is not a very common butterfly. And she lays her eggs on a plant that is in the mustard family, and it looks very similar, and I guess it tastes very similar to the garlic mustard. So she lays her eggs, but her eggs can't actually hatch or eat garlic mustard. So it's just an example of how these plants matter, and if they aren't there and if they aren't quite right, that affects so many other animals. So where do you find native plants? Here is a list of some locations within Ohio. Now locally, there's Riverside Native Trees and Shrubs in Delaware, as well as Scioto Gardens. They're pretty well-known locations to purchase specific native plants, but I'm seeing them really more and more commonly at most nurseries, and you can ask for them. I work with a few of these nurseries, and I travel around every year, and they actually mark the native plants, particularly the native rain garden plants. So if you are out and about, you might see that signage. And some other resources for you. So we have a rebate program, and you can get, I think it's $50 for a rain barrel, a composter, and maybe a native tree. It might be $25 now for native perennials. Because we had so much participation, we needed to take that amount down. But you go through a stormwater quiz. You can come see us. We do workshops every year, and I think we'll be resuming those in person. But you simply sit there and you listen to stuff about stormwater and how to compost, and you can get your rebate and then go buy a native plant. We also have our plant sale going on right now, and it closes at the end of this month. And you can find that sale at Franklin SWCD's main website. To go to the sale tab, it's way over on the right. And I wanted to let you know before I left that my mother got more obedient plant for her landscape when she moved from that house. And it is doing pretty well, although it's probably a bit too shady. Okay, so there is me. I dressed like a flower for Halloween. That is not a native plant. And I think that is all I have for you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was so interesting, and I can't wait for more people to even watch that. And I really appreciate all that you had to say. If you haven't been to Franklin, if you haven't seen their plant sale, I highly recommend going and checking it out. And I think I actually get to help out with some of the backyard conservation talks this year. I think Laura Faye and I are going to be doing them together. So I'm super excited about that. So it's a great class. I've taken it multiple times, and I'm excited to help out as well. Do we have any questions at all? We can open it up really quick. I didn't get any in the chat. Oh. Will there be a slide deck available for viewing after this? There will be, and we actually are recording this right now, so you'll be able to go back and watch it again. Great question.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, Sarah, what kind of issues do you get called about? Are people calling you about native plant questions? I mean, related to native plants, what sort of issues do you have to deal with homeowners?
Well, a lot of it is when people are dealing with problematic sites or problematic neighbors. But in particular, wet sites, if there's areas of standing water or flooding, you're probably familiar with the Columbus Blueprint rain gardens, right? So if that's an issue whereby that infrastructure is not helping, the next step is going to be, what can we do in your backyard? Do we need to fix the grading? Do we need to reroute your gutter? Do we need to take the lawn away and put stepping stones and bring up the soil level, amend the soil? Just plant a complement of arrowwood viburnum and some spring ephemerals and some sedges, and like this plant behind me, this is called skunk cabbage. Now that's for really a wet area, but it's a pretty cool plant. Yeah, and sometimes they have unique habitats, like can I plant the right-of-way area in front of my house. And how do I find out? Who do I ask? What could I plant there?
So are there like different community ordinances that you have to know, like the weed ordinances, for example?
Yes. I can't say I'm aware of all of them. I think maybe Columbus changed something so that people can plant milkweed now. Once it was a noxious weed, and it was called that because of the agricultural fields. It wasn't called that, for any other reason. But of course, different cities in and around Ohio have different ordinances.
Interesting.
Does anybody else have any other questions for Sarah?
What are the what are the go-to easiest native plants that you would recommend?
Oh. Well, I would say the Panicum virgatum, the switchgrass is a really easy native grass. Purple coneflower, I know it's ubiquitous, but believe it or not, it's somewhat unusual to Ohio. It's very special for Ohio, particularly southwestern Ohio. Some of the cedars and evergreens have so many multiple uses. They can function as wildlife cover, as screening for your neighbors who complain about your wet backyard, and they provide, something to look at over winter. So I think the red cedar is underutilized. White pine's a beautiful, stately, gorgeous tree. We don't get to see very many of these older specimens. And of course, I love spring ephemerals, even, maybe like Virginia bluebells. I don't know that that's a go-to plant, but it's so beautiful. I think maybe it is a go-to plant for everybody's mental health.
I know I'm looking forward to the spring ephemerals this year, for sure. Definitely some places that we've taken some honeysuckle out, the non.
Oh, yeah.
So
it's great because you'll see the seed bank is still there. And once they have a little gap, a little space, a little room, they come back. It's really rewarding.
Absolutely. Well, are there any other questions?
I wanted to ask, so if you buy the cultivar version of one of those plants you were talking about, does it have any redeeming features that, is it okay to get those?
It is okay to get this. In my opinion, it is okay to get those. I think any native plant is better than not. Any habitat is better than not. But again, the closest you can stay to something that isn't wacky, like that powwow echinacea with that enormous bloom. There's a woman out there, her name is Annie White, and she did a lot of research on what the differences are and how well the pollinators can use some of these modified native plants. And I think she found out that height of the plant doesn't necessarily matter. Sometimes the color of the leaves matter because of the chemistry associated with the phytochemicals in the leaves themselves. But if the bloom is very similar in size and shape, and the petals have the appropriate platform for the pollinators, that's really important.
I think height's a big issue. So being able to cultivate them so that they're not so high is probably easier in landscapes.
Yes. Some of I love prairie plants, but something like cut plant or cut leaf, the yellow coneflower, those are enormous plants, like 6 or 7 feet tall. So you probably don't want them in your home landscape unless you have got a lot of land. And if there were a shorter variety, birds could probably still utilize that. They would still be beautiful. I haven't seen varieties of those on the market, not quite yet anyway. They're pretty cool.
Yeah. I know they have a shorter version of Joe Pye weed, which can be like 9 feet tall. You can get a shorter one.
Yeah, lots of kinds of Joe Pye weed out there, that's for sure.
Yeah.
That's another very enthusiastic plant.
Well, thank you again, Sarah, so much for talking with us tonight. I really, really appreciate it. And you mentioned compost, and I just want to say, Joanne and I are going to be teaching a class on composting, why you'd want to do it and how to do it, multiple ways that you can do it in Worthington on April 7th, and it's at 7 p.m. You can sign up at the same place you signed up for tonight's talk. We're really excited about it as well, right, Joanne?
That's right, always.
And we really do appreciate all of you attending, and anyone who listens to this, we're grateful that you're listening to this as well. And Sarah, thank you again so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you. I got a lot of good notes.
Thank
Bye.
you. See you.
Okay, bye.